Imagine you have this absolutely crazy roller coaster. It's got loops, launches, airtime, and then make the cars spin. All of a sudden you're going down the first drop sideways, launching backwards, and doing whatever the heck this is. The geniuses that thought of this were over at a company called Mack Rides, and they built a coaster in 2018 called Time Traveler, and it was the first ever Xtreme spinning coaster. There had been spinning coasters in the past, but most of them were small family coasters with very simple layouts. Time Traveler is an amazing ride, but it does have some flaws. So a few years later, Mack Rides opened up another Xtreme spinning coaster, and it seems to do everything that Time Traveler did, but better. If this ride model can make such a big jump from its first to its second coaster, then how insane could the next one be? Let's go back to the beginning. I've been fortunate enough to actually ride Time Traveler, and I'm telling you, it is absolutely nuts. The first drop is only 90 feet, which is tiny compared to other roller coasters, but because it's so steep, and because of the fact that you take it sideways because of the spinning cars, it is almost as good as these drops that are more than 3 times as tall. The problem is that because this first element is so good, it's only downhill from there. You basically meander your way through a couple forceless elements and up onto the launch track, and then you sit there. But after about 10 seconds, you are still sitting there. Eventually, it slowly accelerates to 47 miles per hour before floating through a slow turn. This is the last boring element for a while, because then you go into a 95-foot tall loop, which feels really weird while spinning, and then there's a switchback hill that delivers powerful airtime, and it also gives this weird sensation of kinda lurching forward in your seat, though it's not uncomfortable at all. Before the final launch is a zero-G roll that literally feels like you are doing a backflip at 40 miles an hour, which is crazy. And even right before the final launch, there is this sneaky little bump that totally throws you. But the ride's ending really kills the pacing, because the acceleration on the launch is not very intense, and the final elements don't do anything other than get you back up to the same elevation as the station, because remember, the station is pretty high off the ground. Now, Time Traveler is an incredible ride, but it does have its flaws. While the elements and maneuvers that the ride traverses are amazing, there is too much space between them, so it gives you a chance to catch your breath after every single element. In general, that isn't really a bad thing, but when it's slowed down to that extent, it really interrupts the pace of the ride. So 3 years later in 2021, the second version of this model was to open, and it was going to a small family park in Belgium called Plopsaland, and they named it the Ride to Happiness. Yeah, the name is stupid, but holy crap, look at this thing. Some people who have ridden it ranked it as one of the best coasters in the world. The layout is near perfection, you have crazy disorienting inversions, ridiculously strong G-forces, and powerful airtime moments, and even the launches are said to actually be fairly powerful. Let's look at some of the crazy ideas that Mack Rides came up for with this one. You got a JoJo roll, which is said to deliver up to 5 seconds of hang time. You have this weird top hat element where you rise up and then turn to the left, but the track is banked in the wrong direction. And then you go down this insane drop that is as good, if not better, than Time Traveler's drop. And then this is followed up with a banana roll. People who have ridden this say the G-forces on the banana roll feel like the ones you get on a vertical loop. Like, how does that even work? These elements don't look close to the same. Later in the ride, it literally launches you over an airtime hill, so you're spinning while accelerating, while experiencing airtime all at the same time, and then this is followed up with one of the craziest elements of all time. This is the double inverting dive loop, where you basically go into a dive loop, but there is a 360-degree roll as you are going up the element, so it flips you upside down twice, back to back, while spinning. The ride ends with an airtime hill before a fast low-to-the-ground turn and 2 powerful jolts of airtime right before the brakes. The finale is not as unique as the rest of the ride, but those elements look like they deliver. This coaster was a great leap forward for both Mack Rides and the Xtreme spinning coaster model itself, but what could we look for in the next model? Let's check out some possibilities. Before we even talk about the elements, let's mention the scale of the ride. The 2 coasters of this Xtreme spinner model that have been built in the past are both around 100 100 feet tall. I think that in the near future we could be seeing these things at 150 feet, eventually even 200 feet, but that might be a bit of a stretch for right now, so I made this prediction model at about 150 feet tall. Because of the inflated scale of the ride itself, it means that we can possibly extend the length of the trains from 4 to 5 cars, which usually leads to an increased capacity. Okay, now let's take a look at some elements that we could feature before the ride even gets up to speed. We know Time Traveler has that drop out of the station, but the large majority of coasters are not going to have the station placed 100 feet above the rest of the layout. Of course, you have that slow roll right out of the station on Ride to Happiness, but another option could be a slow outer banked turn, as we see on Ride to Happiness's Top Hat, but this could be located right after the train exits the station, in a similar fashion to the RMC coaster Untamed at Wallaby Holland, or the new hypercoaster going to Thorpe Park in the UK, nicknamed Project Exodus, which is built by Mack Rides, so we know that they're willing to design this maneuver into their rides. Also, remember this Project Exodus coaster, because we'll be coming back to this a lot. Okay, my original idea was to have one of those outer bank turns that we just talked about, but I ended up needing to move the station after I made the rest of the layout so that I could fit in a decent sized brake section to give the train enough room to slow down completely. Because of this, I could only have a 90-degree turn, for which I just kept the banking at 0. But don't be surprised to see one of these outer bank thingies on a spinning coaster in the next few years. Okay, the ride needs to get up to speed, and the most obvious way to do that would be with a launch. But what if we could spice it up a bit with a launched lift hill? Because I think that we could realistically see one of these on an Xtreme spinner sometime soon. Also, it would just be really cool to get a 360-degree view of the park while being launched up a lift hill. Okay, now that we're at the top, we could either go down into a little pre-drop section or just right into the drop. And the reason I mention a pre-drop is because it could have a similar effect to that little turn that Ride to Happiness has at its maximum height. But I think that having a pre-drop off of a lift hill in this context seems to be a waste of space and track, especially since this coaster is just on flat ground and not hilly terrain. So now we have it narrowed down to just a regular drop off of the lift hill. We could go right into a straight drop, or we could do some sort of a 90-degree twisted drop like we see on DC Rival's Hypercoaster in Australia, which is known to have one of the best first drops in the world. But what if we take that even further? Let's look back to Project Exodus, which features a 180-degree twisted drop. I think that a crazy drop like that would go very well with the spinning this ride would have. This would turn the track back towards the base of the lift hill, and I think we should follow this up with another large element. I think this should be a similar element to the turnaround on the new launch coaster coming to China, which is called Beyond the Cloud. But this version would not turn completely around 180 degrees, so that it could have more airtime on the way down due to the fact that it's not turning as much. The shaping of this almost makes it feel like a top hat, which is an element that is almost exclusively found right after the main launch on launch coasters, but this actually flows really well coming after the first drop. The crest of this element would sustain some borderline ejector airtime at -0.4 Gs before increasing to -1 Gs on the way down, which would give a similar feel to the first drop on Skyrush at Hershey Park. The traditional airtime that the ride's first drop lacks is more than made up for with this crazy element. I think it's about time we throw in an inversion. For this, I'm thinking that we could do a reverse version of the double inverting dive loop on Ride to Happiness, which we discussed earlier. What I mean by that is that instead of traversing an upwards barrel roll into a dive loop, the train would do the reverse of that, which would be going into an Immelman, but instead of just going into a half loop and then leveling out as it drops down, which is what happens on a normal Immelman, it will have a downwards barrel roll on the exit. This would have a similar effect to the death roll located on Iron Gwazi at Busch Gardens Tampa, except, of course, spinning. I say that really casually as if it's a normal maneuver for a roller coaster, but this would literally be one of the most insane coaster moments on the planet. The next element I had in mind was a banana roll, which I discussed before is featured on an Xtreme spinning coaster, so we know that Mack is willing to put a banana roll on these rides. Except when I tried putting that in the ride, it did not really flow how I'd wanted, and the placement did not really work. So I tried something else. This new idea would have a tiny little switchback hill used as a filler element to try to make room for the next element. Because if I just made this right after the previous element, it would run into the lift hill. The idea was to take an Immelman maneuver, but significantly stretch out the portion of track that is suspended upside down, so that it would give hang time reminiscent of that found on a 0G stall. I got this idea from the reverse version of this element on Project Exodus. But that would not be the only crazy part of this element, as it would also have a really fast transition out of the stall portion of the element, which was inspired by the transition out of the 0G stall on Zadra at Energylandia. Taking this wild maneuver while spinning would be absolutely ridiculous. Next up is a massive outer banked airtime hill, similar to the ones that you can find on Project Exodus. This element was introduced and popularized by Rocky Mountain Construction, and in recent years, new manufacturers have been putting it on their coasters. This shaping is most reminiscent of the outer banked hill on Steel Vengeance at Cedar Point, with the apex of the hill being very drawn out, resulting in a sustained moment of negative g-forces. Such a great moment of airtime should be followed up with an inversion on an inversion-focused coaster like this, so I put in a 0G roll, which has proven to work very well in the layouts of Time Traveler and Ride to Happiness. This element provides an extremely disorienting sensation, but that's fine because the following portion of the layout would have more airtime-focused elements, similar to the finale of Ride to Happiness, which has a larger hill, an overbanked turn, and a couple smaller hills before the brakes. I had to have this 0G roll finish pretty high off the ground in order to avoid the track that it crosses over. This allows me to put in this little switchback transition that brings the train back down to ground level. The next element is one that would feel very unique on this type of ride, a wave turn. This would flip the track to the side and then traverse a little sideways bump that would pop riders out of their seat a bit. Since the track is banked 90 degrees, some riders would be taking this element facing completely downwards or facing straight up in the air. The final element of the ride is this powerful airtime hill that will give a similar feeling to the tiny little hill that is right before the final launch on Time Traveler, but of course this would be more drawn out and the force would be sustained for longer. So while this layout does have many wacky new elements, all of them are derived from very similar maneuvers that the ride's manufacturer has put on other coasters. Alright, now it's time for the POV. Enjoy.